This morning, we're continuing our study in Genesis, as I mentioned, and in particular, we're in chapter 8 of Genesis. And if you haven't done that already, I'd like for you on the outside to go through that book and chapter 8 in particular and study that and even continue on to chapter number 9. And both of those gives us really important information as God tells us about the creation and about that great flood of Noah that we've been studying the past few lessons. That's of particular interest to me. I've gotten out in the creation many times and studying it. Even at the introduction to the first song had some good geology there, and I could spot areas that were formed and modified and created essentially during that great flood of Noah. So we can see the evidence for the flood anywhere on planet Earth that we go, anywhere. I've been quite a few miles east to west and across this land here, a great United States of America, and even offshore, way down into the Pacific, just north of Australia, and off to the southeastern part of the ocean, off the coast. And everywhere I go, I see evidence of not just the creation, it's all around us, of course, but that great flood of Noah that modified the whole earth. There's great evidence for it. And today we'll be continuing that look at the great flood of Noah. You might recall from last time, we were looking at some logs that can tell us very much about the flood. We looked at a couple of these slides that we'll see coming up, but I wanted to amplify on those a little bit, give you a bit more information. And this information is concerning the great flood of Noah, things happening during that great flood. And today we'll be looking at modern evidence that demonstrate what was happening during the flood of Noah. There are great things happening during Noah's flood, tremendous energy expelled in that flood. And we'll see some of that evidence today through modern examples that give us evidence of what was happening during that great flood of Noah. So Lydia would like to start out with slide number 7, where we'll be looking at some interesting things that were happening during the explosion of Mount St. Helens during our lifetime. I recall it well, that May, about many years ago. I'm sure most of you weren't around at that time, but I was. And I took great interest in this because it was demonstrating things that happened during the Great Flood that we're reading about in our Bible, the Great Flood of Noah. As we look at this, we're looking now at a scene that's near Mount St. Helens, and that mountain is in the background. It's a volcanic mountain, and it exploded and blew the top off. And you can see the top is missing from that thing in the background. And interestingly, it's 5 miles from us, but it looks like you could just pick up a rock and throw it and hit it over there. But it's a great distance from us. But what was happening during that Mount St. Helens eruption was this. The mountain was much taller at that time before the eruption. And what happened was about 1/8 of a cubic mile of material came out of it all of a sudden, slid down that northern side that we're looking at there, and was deposited in what was then Spirit Lake. And this is modern day Spirit Lake that was reformed during the flood. Well, when that big chunk of the mountain came down and hit Spirit Lake, what it did was generated a wave that was 860 feet high. Now, how do we know that? Well, if you look around to the sides here at the hills and low mountains to the right and left, you can see there's no trees on them. And what happened when that 860-foot wave came through this lake, it took off 1,000,000 trees and deposited them in Spirit Lake. Folks, that took a lot of energy. You'll see those logs, at least the ones that are left, floating now, still there on Mount St. Helens Lake, called Spirit Lake. You'll notice there are no limbs on those great trees. Many of these trees were 5, 6 feet, 8 feet in diameter, huge trees. They were snapped off at the ground and broken up, their trunks broken, their limbs were removed at that great explosion and energy that hit that area. And what we see here is the result of that. Just tree trunks at most, broken, and limbs missing, and just evidence of a great cataclysm that hit in modern times. Now think about this now. During the flood of Noah, there was great volcanic action, many volcanoes going off, and we'll see evidence of that as we go through our lesson this morning. But after that wave hit, those that 1,000,000 trees was deposited here. And when my wife and I went into Canada and Alberta, we saw some of the same evidence up there that we're seeing here, but it was from the great flood of Noah. We were studying volcanic ash up there that was hundreds of feet deep. And we saw evidence of that and things that were in it that we'll look at in just a moment. Now let's go to slide number 8. We'll see more evidence here from Mount St. Helens explosion here in what is Spirit Lake afterwards. And we're seeing trees, not only horizontal ones, which we can see in the background here, and we saw in that other slide, but we're seeing vertical trees floating in Spirit Lake, and that's interesting. Now, as we go further in our study, we'll see vertical trees that were deposited during that great flood of Noah. So let's go ahead to slide number 10, please. And what we're seeing here is strata in the ground there. If we could dig down the ground, we would see levels of individual strata that were laid down during the great flood of Noah. And in that flood were deposited trees like we see in Mount St. Helens today. And some of those trees were vertical as they were in that water and deposited by that great amount of sediment that was being deposited around them. Now, interestingly, the evolutionist has looked at these vertical petrified trees here. We can see these two, and there's some in the background you can see. And my wife and I have been out there and observed these things. In actuality, we've studied them and looked at them, and we've come to the conclusion it's evident that these trees were deposited by water, by a great flood, if you will, during that time of what was happening during the great flood of Noah. And here we're seeing evidence of trees that did not grow there, as the evolutionist says. And if you dig down around these trees, these petrified trees, you'll see evidence there that people have gathered where they say that these were not growing in a soil horizon. They were just deposited in a great flood. And we know that flood to be the great flood of Noah. And that's very interesting to me. Actual evidence here that defies what the evolutionist believes and what is read in scripture from this great flood of Noah. That's very interesting. But that strata was deposited at that time during the great flood of Noah. Now, as we look at slide number 10, we see strata that were deposited by Mount St. Helens. As we look at slide number 10 here. Now, we were up there studying this, walking through these fields of deposited layers, and we were seeing evidence of that great flood of Noah. And right here is evidence not from the great flood of Noah, but from strata that were laid down during the Mount St. Helens blast. Now we can see the evidence in the background there of strata. Strata are certain levels, more than one level of sediment that were laid down. And we get a close-up view of it in the photo at the bottom there. You can see individual layers then from the activity of Mount St. Helens. That's interesting because we see that layer, those layers that were deposited during the eruption of Mount St. Helens, these layers, many tens of feet thick, as we'll see later. Later, they were deposited not in millions of years, as it appears to the evolutionists, but they were deposited very quickly in just a small amount of time, seconds and minutes in some cases. And that's interesting. Now, as we were up in Canada, look at this, looking at ash that was deposited up there more than 100 feet deep, exposed. We're looking at cuts of ash more than 100 feet thick, and it went on down below that too. But what we saw there were trees and other things deposited in those layers that the evolutionist says took millions of years to lay down. We saw tree parts. We saw trees that had been snapped off from the roots, and the trunks were deposited in that strata. And we also saw dinosaur fossils that were formed after they were deposited there in those great strata up in Canada. And that's interesting. I wanted to show you here today some things we found there. I'm not sure how good these will come out, but this particular example is a piece of what's called mudstone. Now, because of its name, we can tell where it came from. This was during that great flood of Noah when mud was generated and dinosaurs were coincidentally deposited in this same mud at that time. And we see evidence of that in this piece of mudstone that we found. Now there's a piece of dinosaur bone right there. Looks like part of a rib of a dinosaur, and Edmontosaurus dinosaur. And that's interesting. This rock can actually talk when you listen to it. It's telling us about a great cataclysm that was happening. And that, of course, was Noah's flood. And it broke up thousands of dinosaurs right where we were in that time. And that was interesting to me. You walk around, you could not walk without stepping on dinosaur bones. And we were finding these bones, and this is one of them. This is a section of rib bone. You see it was broken up, broken into pieces, and there's a crack that was left in it from that time. And it's telling us there were great forces happening during Noah's flood. And this is another piece of a fossil bone, and you can see it was broken up and hit with mighty forces during that great flood of Noah. And that's what we're seeing too as we look at sediment and layers from Mount St. Helens. And these are layers here, strata, more than one layer. See many, many layers of strata here. And you can see a general idea of how large that section is by that person standing there at the bottom. Now that deposition from Mount St. Helens goes above even these layers we see here, many, many feet. So something traumatic was happening during that explosion of Mount St. Helens. And these things were happening during the flood of Noah. And we're seeing similar things in the geology of today and modern deposition. So let's look at slide number 11 here. And we can see greater evidence even that was formed during Mount St. Helens explosion. And of course, that's the sediments we're looking at right here. And again, the evolutionist says these sediments would have been deposited by evolution over millions of years. And we know that not to be true. But slide number 12 gives us further evidence of what was happening during the time of the flood, as well as the eruption of Mount St. Helens. During most events, all those events, what was happening was these trees were broken up and some were floating horizontally, as this one is. We see that in Spirit Lake, and we see it too in deposition from the flood of Noah. And during the flood of Noah, we would have had upright floating logs like that we see in Spirit Lake, even with the roots still on them. A lot of them that were floating vertically in Spirit Lake had rocks still enclosed by the roots, and that's what was holding them vertical. But as then, during the flood of Noah, as the water went down, these logs and wood debris would have been deposited then horizontally in some cases, vertically in other cases, and completely buried as we see it in other cases, even with the root structures left on. So there's good evidence for us to study in modern times of what was happening during that great flood. But that's interesting to me. We can see this evidence today that's left by modern events that were happening during the great flood of Noah. Except during that great flood of Noah, the events would have been much stronger and much more fierce as we study then. So we're seeing the same effects today, although lessened forces, but still strong forces during the modern events that were happening. Now let's look at slide number 13. We see something very interesting here. And when we were out at Mount St. Helens one time, been out there a couple of times to study it, but the first time we went, we were able to climb up the side of Mount St. Helens to a certain point. Now we couldn't go further than I wanted to go up to the edge of the crater and look over, but they wouldn't let us do that. It's too dangerous. There were still boulders rolling off the sides of the crater, which we can see here. When they rolled off, they stirred up a lot of dust, a lot of volcanic ash. It was dangerous to be up near the edge of the crater at that time. But during that time, things were happening. There was a center part called a lava dome that was coming up in the center of that big crater. And things were happening there that was telling us what was happening during the great flood of Noah too. But as we look now at the distance, we can see over to the right there, still within the slide, we can see the modern Spirit Lake that's 5 miles away as it was during that eruption. But it's been modified. It's not in the same shape or location that it was before that great eruption. The forces there moved that lake and did tremendous damage to all of that area. Now we can look and see all around these mountain surfaces here, the hills and mountains, that the trees are missing. And that's where the trees came from. And you can see them, at least part of them, over in Spirit Lake there, where 1,000,000 trees wound up in that water. So there's evidence there of a great cataclysm that happened during the time of Mount St. Helens and its eruption. And like I mentioned, the tremendous volcanic activity during the great flood of Noah would have been doing things similar to this, but even greater in scope. More tremendous things were happening during the flood. And it's hard for us to imagine if things like this could happen in modern times. Just think of what was happening during the great flood of Noah, the tremendous forces involved, and things happening that we can hardly imagine, but we get just a hint of it when we look at eruptions from modern volcanoes. But this gives us an idea of what was happening during the time of the flood. Now, as we look at slide number 14, we're going back to the crater of Mount St. Helens and seeing what was happening a little bit during that time of its eruption. Now, there's an inset down at the bottom of that slide that shows the crater and also the lava dome that was forming during that time. Now, when we walked up on the side of Mount St. Helens, you can see that my cursor there, that's about where we would have been. We didn't get to go right up to the edge of the crater there, which was still dangerous, but we got to see from the north side when we were walking up, we could see that lava dome, and it's having been built at that time. We could see steam coming from it, like we see in this slide here. It was a very active thing when we were still there. So we got to see some activity, geologic activity there still going on. We saw the results of that explosion that happened there at Mount St. Helens. Well, we're seeing the lava dome here. Now think about this now. From one crater edge to the other is 1.2 miles. That gives you an idea of the scale of things we're looking at. Now, as we looked at Mount St. Helens from the crater here, it was 5 miles away. And things are deceptive when you look at the scenery when we're out there. But we're looking at the lava dome here that was 900 feet higher than where the base was, and it was about 2/3 of a mile across when it had grown to this point. And that's interesting. Now, the evolutionist says things happen very slowly over time as a rule, and millions of years are involved. But when we see that lava dome, we realize things could happen very quickly. And we see that crater that was opened up, and a portion of a cubic mile of material was removed from that crater. Now, interestingly, when it got safe enough for scientists to go down and do some work on this lava dome, a fellow we've met and worked with, I'll call him Steve because that's his name, but he wanted to go down and get a sample of this lava dome. Now we know when it came about. At the eruption of Mount St. Helens there, about a little over 20 years now. And what was interesting, he was able to gain a sample of material there that was, he sent off potassium argon testing. Now that's a scientific test you can do on rocks, potassium argon testing. Now, what it does is measure the amount of argon in rocks. Now, argon is a gas. So when rock is molten and that gaseous material starts coming out, how much would we expect in just freshly laid rock that's been molten moments before, days before? We should expect none almost left. Could expect potassium, but the argon, after a certain amount of time, is outgassed from that rock. And if the rock's molten, most all of that argon should have been sent out of that rock. It should have been outgassed from that rock. So how old would we expect a rock to be that came out of a volcano, was molten moments ago, days ago? And how much of that argon should we expect to be in it? We should expect none to be in it, essentially. Maybe just a few molecules that somehow were trapped in it. But he had that potassium argon test run on that rock, and the evolutionists would say that that rock would be at least 350,000 years old, based on what he determines from his thinking on that. But that's how long the potassium argon test showed, 350,000 years. But it should have showed what? If we look at reality, it should have showed zero, essentially. It should have shown just being a baby, just born. But the test showed 350,000 years. And that's the problem we find with these tests like that. We cannot depend on them to show the actual age. And this definitely proves that from this sample of rock that Steve tested. And that's interesting. What it shows is truth of what God's word says and being formed during the flood of Noah. So the Bible is truth. It's truthful in what it says to us, and it always is. And it shows that millions of years were not involved in the formation of the geological processes. But I say our time's about up. Next time we'll look further at this and talk about it a little bit.